This week, we welcome Sean Metcalf, founder and CTO at Trimark Security. He's going to discuss post-breach. The hardening continues. What you should do after a breach. In the security news, Cisco hates patching stuff. They hacked a Peloton. So what? Zen bleeding. Stopping Kia boys. Your BMC is showing, and it's hackable. Hacking your toothbrush. Flipper Zero smoking a smart meter was likely fake. RFID tags inside Amazon products. Backdoors and encrypted police radios. The death of InfoSec Twitter. And just stop people from accessing the internet, and we'll all be fine. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. SOC analysts are often overworked and underappreciated. In fact, many consider leaving their jobs or changing careers altogether. Devo is hosting the third annual SOC Analyst Appreciation Day to pay some long overdue kudos to analysts and encourage organizations to improve their job satisfaction and mental well-being. Join Devo and other cybersecurity industry professionals on October 18th for sessions and panels focused on de-stressing, SOC career development, and more. Visit securityweekly.com/Devo to register.
And welcome to the show. But first, let me introduce you to a man whose son once asked him, where does poo come from? Well, this man was a little uncomfortable and gave him an honest explanation. His son looked at him a little perplexed and stared at him for a good second and then asked, and Tigger? Mr. Paul Asadorian.
Welcome, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly, coming to you in super low definition compliments of Darth Vader himself. It's episode number 792, being recorded on July 26, 2023, right here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. To my left, Mr. Larry Pesce.
Yeah, hey,
is that your flipper or my flipper?
I have the nice orange case on it.
I have one of the nice orange cases, and I have a black 3D printed one.
Yep.
But my antenna add-on
doesn't fit
it.
And I got to do an update, so I figured I'd at least maybe do an update during the show or something.
Yes.
But
which firm are you gonna put on there though?
This one I think is going to get the most updated default firmware.
Gotcha.
Put the other fun stuff on the other one.
Yeah, I think you need two flippers. Yeah. Hopefully we'll have some segments coming up on that.
Yeah. But it's been a couple of weeks since I've been here.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know it's good to have you back, man.
I know, and every week the resolution was getting lower and lower and lower, and I've been gone for like 5 or 6 weeks, so I can imagine the resolution's 2x4 now.
Oh yeah, it keeps degrading slowly over
next
time.
Next week it'll be 1x2, and next thing it'll be 0 pixels by 0 pixels.
I mean, we'll be almost like Josh Marpet's hair. I mean, non-existent.
Speaking of Josh Marpet,
Josh Marpet's here. Oh, hey Josh, you're here. Welcome to the show.
Hey, nice to see you too.
That's how many hairs he's got on the top of his head.
For our audio listeners, Josh was using his sign language.
Yes.
Hey, it's good to have you, buddy.
I can do it with both hands too.
You're so talented. Mr. Jeff Mann is here with us from the Man Cabin.
Yes, I am. When my kids were little, I convinced them that this was a gesture in traffic that meant "Have a nice day."
Oh no!
Yes.
Seriously?
Yep.
How many drivers did they wish a nice day to for you?
All of them.
More than I could count. Yeah, all of them.
Yep.
Oh boy. Couple of quick announcements before we get into it. Attend InfoSec World 2023 at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort, September 23rd through the 28th. Listeners receive a 20% discount when registering using the code ISW23-SecWeek20 at securityweekly.com/InfoSecWorld 2023. On my website, securitypodcaster.com, you can also find links to the podcasts I host, podcasts I listen to, some book recommendations, and my current ridiculous PC build spec at securitypodcaster.com. The funny part about my ridiculous PC build spec is it's vulnerable to Zen bleed, which is awesome. I can sniff my own passwords. Sounds like a euphemism. Sean Metcalf is the founder and CTO at TriMarkSecurity.com, a professional services company that focuses on improving enterprise security. He is one of about 100 people in the world who holds the Microsoft Certified Master Directory Services Active Directory certification. He's also a Microsoft MVP and has presented at security conferences such as Black Hat, B-Sides, DevCon, and DerbyCon. Sean, welcome to the show.
Hey, Paul. Good to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me on. That is definitely an older intro. I am no longer Microsoft MVP, so we can change that to former Microsoft MVP.
Former Microsoft MVP, and also welcome back to the show, as you've appeared on the show several times, and you are also a host on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Yeah. So you got me Wednesday night, and I'll be on ESW again tomorrow. or there tomorrow. So it's fun being on the network and bouncing around. So thanks for having me.
It's awesome. It's good to have you, man. And it's funny. Like, I thought some of our conversation, Sean, was going to go into some of these like really esoteric Windows things, and we might end up talking about some of those things. But when Sean and I were chatting about what we're going to do on the show, he was like, yeah, there's like basic things that people still aren't doing. So
No way.
We should probably talk about some of those and how we do incident response on Windows. So do clients contact you like once they've discovered a breach? Is that one of the services you do, or is it kind of a natural?
They contact him after somebody tells them that they've been breached. That's how it works, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
No, actually, we don't do breach services or incident response, but we have consulted during those in the past. So when there's been an Active Directory or Azure AD breach, we provided subject matter expertise during and after. We've worked with a number of companies after they have had a breach, they have recovered. We worked with one organization that had a significant ransomware incident a couple years ago, and their entire forest would have to be rebuilt.
Wow.
Here's a fun tip for everyone listening. If you haven't checked recently, check to see if you have a Microsoft supported backup of your Active Directory environment. This is as simple as a system state backup on your domain controller. If you're using something like Veeam or Commvault, you have to enable that option. It's not a default. And if you don't enable that option, guess what? You're going to be paying that company and Microsoft a lot of money, because that's what this organization had to do. And we helped them harden things up after the actual breach.
I think it's a great start, Sean, because when we think about incident response, we might tabletop an incident response, exercise as a tabletop exercise, right? And one of the questions you should be asking is, what if someone wipes out our Active Directory? Where do we go for the backup? But the answer is, it's a multi-part question and answer too, because it depends if you are on premise or in the cloud or some combination of the two as to like which one will back up and restore. I briefed with a company called Semperis. Are you familiar with them?
I know Semperis well. Mickey Bresman and I have hung out. And
Mickey's a great guy. He's a great guy.
Yeah. I'm going to be back in Vegas in a couple of weeks, and I'm sure Mickey and I will end up having drinks and chatting and hanging out for a bit.
That's good, because him and his company, they're experts at the backup stuff. At least that's the sense I got when I briefed with them and spoke with them a few years ago. So, but it begs the question. So, I mean, what's your advice? I mean, products aside, like Semperis is not a sponsor, but I think we agree we like their product. But there's other products and other methodologies for ensuring you've got a backup of your Active Directory, and then two, a plan to restore it, because that depends, right? How
they could be a sponsor if they wanted to be.
That's right. We're more than welcome.
And after Sean's done, I've also got a recommendation that's a little tongue in cheek. So
okay,
you, Larry, surprise.
No, I know.
So, Sean, what have you done when the last time you did this? How long did it take? What kind of level of effort are we talking about?
Well, I guess first, Sean, explain to people like what the backup and restore process is for Active Directory on-prem and cloud.
So, Sean, describe Active Directory backup and recovery on-prem and then Azure AD go.
Yeah.
In 100 words or less. Go.
Yeah, exactly.
We're firing off with the hard questions.
2 words, you're fucked.
Yeah, exactly. So the fun thing about this is I was at a customer site probably in 2018-ish in California, and I had an argument, a pretty heated argument about Active Directory backup and recovery. And it really came down to this person was telling me that they were absolutely certain that they were backing up their Active Directory environment. There is a quick way to check because there's an attribute in Active Directory that you can query for the date of the last Microsoft supported Active Directory backup. And this date will show up when that happens. It's one of the bits that has to get flipped as part of a Microsoft supported backup of Active Directory. A lot of products do not flip this bit. They just do a snapshot of a domain controller, or they just do a snapshot of AD itself. So if you query Active Directory for this attribute, and you don't get a current date, guess what? You are not backing up your Active Directory in a way that Microsoft can support you. What does that mean? If it's not a Microsoft supported backup, you're going to pay a lot of money to do a recovery. Active Directory recoveries suck. They absolutely do. They are difficult. They're challenging. That's why companies like Semperis and Quest have products around this that make it easier, where it's effectively automating those manual tasks. Because if you have 50 domain controllers distributed globally, guess what you're going to have to do as part of a manual recovery process? Rebuild each of those DCs and reestablish them to where they were before. If you don't have a backup of those DCs, then you're going to have to rebuild the DC and rejoin them, which is going to be a problem because Active Directory is not going to understand that. So even those people that are raising their hand on the back and saying, yeah, I know that I have a Microsoft supported backup of Active Directory, keep your hand up if you have a supportable backup for Azure AD and Microsoft 365. I bet pretty much everyone dropped their hand because
I was
not
curious. I want to unpack this strange term you keep using, Microsoft supported.
That used to be an oxymoron.
Is it fair to assume that doesn't automatically come with whatever level of Microsoft support most organizations have, just for getting, Patch Tuesday releases and things like that? It sounds like this is an add-on.
Oh, no, you can absolutely back up your domain controller using Microsoft Backup, doing a system state backup, and just checking the box and saying you want a system state on a domain controller. That is a supported backup. What is not supported is your standard third-party backup system, whether it's NetBackup, NetBackup, Commvault, Quest, Semperis. As long as they are flipping that bit and going through the process and providing a mechanism where you can get a system state backup or similar of the domain controller of Active Directory, then you can restore Active Directory to the state where it can be recovered and continue and operate. The problem comes in where you have, say, Commvault, and I'm not picking on Commvault, and you don't have a system state backup. Well, for those who are familiar with Commvault, they know that Commvault data of that backup is stored in SQL. SQL tends to rely on a service account, which is stored in Active Directory. So you end up with a little bit of this chicken and the egg problem where you have to have Active Directory in order to restore Active Directory. So what does that mean?
The technical term for that is dependency hell.
Yes. Yeah. So there is definitely some dependencies there that have to be established and understood in order to recover it. Yeah, we spent a lot of time talking about the backup and recovery process. It's one of those things we've heard for years. Your backup process is only, or your backup and recoverability is only as good as your testing of that, and that you've tested and proven that it's done. I'm pretty certain that almost nobody has tested their recovery process of Active Directory. I've done it once or twice in my career, in a lab environment, and yeah, it's not easy. It's not fun. That's why Quest and Semperis both have products to automate it and make it easier to recover from a disaster scenario. And there's things like Commvault, which can do restoration of individual objects that have been deleted. But when it comes to the full forest or full ransomware situation, that gets very challenging. And, let's bring this back to what the conversation was where we were headed, Paul. In the situation where you have a breach, how long has it been that you've been breached? When did this start? When did the attacker actually embed itself in the environment? And are your backups actually still clean, or have they been tampered with?
Yeah, that's another thing that you have to practice and do in your tabletop is understand, or getting to a point once you've discovered an incident and picking that point in time that I think it goes back to here. Because only then can you start executing the rest of your incident response plan, which should be start restoring from backups if you have them, right? And so how do you get to there? I mean, there's a whole bunch of basically digital forensics you have to do to get to the point of this is when I think we were breached. And sometimes you can't answer that question accurately. And that could be because you lack processes or because it's just a hard question to answer for every single system. And
because you lack processes.
Because you lack processes, yeah.
Or you don't have the logs associated with it, which is another issue that we see in so at Triumph, we do security assessments of Active Directory, Azure AD, and VMwares. And one of the things that we see across these platforms, definitely in Active Directory and VMware and also Active Directory certificate services, is that there's limited logging enabled. And in addition to that, there are logs that are not configured that should be configured in order to detect this potentially malicious activity. And so in a lot of the environments that we look at, they have 2 or more domains in their Active Directory force. They'll have a root domain, so like domain.com, and then they'll have a child domain like prod.domain.com. Prod.domain.com has pretty good auditing. Domain.com absolutely does not have good auditing, which means that if I'm an attacker and I'm performing activity that I know is going to be visible or malicious, I'm going to find a domain controller in domain.com, target that with my tooling, so that way it's probably not going to get logged, and then I can compromise everything else from that root domain in the environment.
I painted this scenario earlier, Sean, where if I do this thing like if I were the CISO, and when I listen to smart people like yourself talk about areas that I'm not as intimately familiar with because I'm a Linux guy, but like I try and understand enough about Windows to make recommendations and talk to people like you. But if I were the CISO, I'd be like, one, like in my checklist of things that I want to make sure that we have, and if we don't implement it right away, it's appropriate event management for your Windows Active Directory environment. That also includes something like Sysmon or something that gives me the equivalent of Sysmon. I think Sysmon, I don't know how much you agree, but from what other experts tell me, Sysmon's pretty good. You just got to collect that and put it in a place where it can be analyzed, right? To me, that's kind of table stakes.
I agree entirely. I think that so there's certain steps to it, right, Paul? There's the actually configuring the auditing to an appropriate level.
Yeah.
Then there's making sure that those appropriate security logs and audit logs are flowing into a tool that can capture and aggregate them, some sort of centralized logging system. It doesn't matter what it is, from Splunk to Sentinel to whatever Google's one is that I forget now.
I can't never remember the name of it. Google does have one. It's pretty good too.
It's like Chronicle or something like that. Right?
Yeah. Well, Chronicle is the company. I can't remember what the product is. In any case,
Chronicle is the product. Google Chronicle is the product with Vertex AI. The threat that's the AI Bard that they've repurposed to doing the answering the questions, and the Mandiant threat intel. But Chronicle is the security product.
Okay, good. So, yeah, from whatever that SIM is, and then the next step is someone has to be looking at it. You have to have alerting and some sort of workflow around it. And if one of these alerts fires off, what is the action? What is the next step? Without each of these components being in place, there is no good way that anything's going to happen out of this. And Paul, as we were talking earlier about this, like, it doesn't really matter where those logs go as long as something is being done with it and they're being processed and reviewed and analyzed, whether it's a managed security service provider or your own SOC. But ultimately, you've got to make sure that all of the systems that are logging these things, that the data is coming from those systems and flowing into that central logging system. We've done analysis in environments where we've seen that there are 60 domain controllers, and 7 of them are not actually sending their logs to the SIM. Now, obviously, it's not obvious by looking at it or even what you can see in Active Directory to know that. You'd have to look at the SIM to see that. But a lot of the systems that are out there don't have great analysis or alerting around, okay, we were getting logs from the system and now we aren't anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a condition that when I pick on logs, I pick on that because it's a security event, but it's a security misconfiguration in your own architecture, not something that typically an attacker would trigger, right? But it's something you should be monitoring for, but it's a failure in your monitoring system too, which is kind of a weird yin-yang kind of relationship they have with each other. Like a security event is when something that was logging stops logging. But the harder thing to trigger for is if something was never logging and it should be logging, how do I know?
Right.
But that's where you guys come in, right? That's you have to audit your systems.
Yeah, it's the unknown unknowns, and a lot of the times that when we talk to folks on the phone, they've reached out to us. One of the things that we hear a lot is, I don't know what I don't know. Help me understand this thing that is Active Directory security or Azure AD security, or we've never looked at VMware before, which no one has. Trimark, please help us out with that. And so we look at a number of things to help them figure out how to be more resilient against ransomware, be more resilient against these attacks because of our comprehensive approach to looking at the system, looking at the environment, using proprietary and custom tooling, combined with people that are really good at connecting dots, that understand both operations and security, and being able to tie this all together in a way that they can actually get things fixed, which I think is the other big issue that we've had in the industry, where I've talked to folks and they said, yeah, we had, this company do a pen test, and then 6 months later, this company do a pen test, and they feel like it's just whack-a-mole, where they are just kind of fixing these problems as they hear about them, and then they have another pen test and a bunch of these things come up. Now, certainly with some of the top tier security companies that are out there, they're going to provide all the issues that they find. But I've certainly heard of ones where, folks will hold back certain things that they have identified for their next pen test with the same customer. And like it or not, that's kind of where the industry has been for years. Yeah. So my approach to a security assessment is we're going to try to find everything that the attacker would see in your environment, and then here's how to fix it. And ultimately, when a company's been breached, I talk sometimes about like closing the barn door after the horses are out, which is kind of like a breach scenario, right? But at the same time, when you have a company come in to do an incident response, they're tracking what that timeline is, Paul. Like you said, how do you know when it started? They're doing their best to figure out patient zero, and then from there, track all the things that were done, figure out what are the systems that were affected, how to clean that up, evict the attacker, and then tighten things up. But they're really only focused on tightening those things up that they know the attacker touched or did during that time. Yeah. Very rarely are you going to get good advice on, oh, and by the way, you have these other 20 things that you should probably fix, or you'll get breached again, which is why I think post-breach hardening is one of those things that really isn't talked about enough, where you've had a breach, you've already probably lost some good staff, you spent a lot of money, you've had a reputation hit. This is a great time to really evaluate do analysis of your environment. Where are things today? What are the things that need to be improved? Certainly some of that was highlighted and underscored by the breach and a lot of the things that came out of that. But the next steps are those things that will protect you in the long run, instead of having another attacker that drops in the near future. I mean, we heard about Sony and some of the others where there are active attackers, multiple active attackers on the same network, competing against each other and trying to open and close security holes to keep out the others and keep their own territory, almost like their own little red versus blue.
Yeah, it's like an active CTF, but it was on Sony's network. Yeah.
So if I can interject real quick, Sean, I'm curious. It sounds good in theory, but I'm wondering, how does an organization go about doing that reset, that evaluation, when they are likely accustomed to, only meeting some sort of regulatory compliance requirement, whatever they're beholden to. What tangibly, materially do you suggest organizations do in terms of doing this reset? Because they got to measure against something.
Right. As far as a reset goes,
what do they measure against?
A great point.
Yeah, MITRE ATT&CK, perhaps?
Right. It's a great point.
They've got 17 tools that claim to do that already for them.
Claim it, but yeah. Sorry, Sean, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and that goes into the tool debate, right? So can a tool solve security? Well, anyone that's going to go walk through the Black Hat Hall in a couple weeks, like I will see dozens of companies out there purporting and claiming that their tool will solve security, right? Has it happened yet?
Silver bullets.
Yeah, but they're all going to be AI based. this year.
Sure.
Trust me, I'm on the media mailing list, so largely they're all going to be dismissed by me at least. But so the question stands: What do you do? What do you measure against? How do you approach this reset in a tangible way?
For a reset, insofar as what though?
Like hardening. I think you mean, Jeff, hardening your. Let's even limit it to Active Directory for the purpose of this conversation. How do I? What do I use as a guide to harden my Active Directory environment? Because I've had a breach. They took a path. Maybe I closed down that path and I fixed 3, 4, 5, 6 things, and I think what you were describing, where I was going, Sean, was now I'm thinking, I'm good. I'm probably not going to get breached again because I closed down that path, not realizing that there's about 127 other things that I might need to address, that the same exact thing can happen again, just using a different scenario. Okay,
absolutely. So really it comes down to looking at some of the key things in Active Directory. So everyone kind of goes towards who's in domain admins, right? Group enumeration. There's permissions, there's group policy settings. There's a number of different things in Active Directory that are key to security, core to security. A number of these things have been identified, blogged about, talked about. I think it's a matter of ensuring that there's a comprehensive review of your environment to not just go, all right, we're going to look at these things and check to see where you're at and then compare you to, I don't know, CIS benchmarks. That's not going to solve the problem. I think that really what needs to be done is a analysis or review of that breach report of what were the things the attacker did, and then what are the things that are still outstanding in that environment by looking at all the other settings and things that could be used in any Active Directory in order to escalate and continue persist in the environment, as well as engage in that environment in a way that's going to be stealthy. So the standard things that we always talk about, like lateral movement, and the fact that many environments still aren't managing their local admin passwords on workstations and servers, which is just crazy to me.
Come on, man! They manage them fine. They're on Post-it notes, right there on the monitor. What's the problem?
Well, not even that. Typically, the user credentials are not the local admin credentials, but the local admin credentials could be the same for every system. Is that still a problem?
It's still a problem.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Still a problem.
It's just crazy.
But I'm still not satisfied, Sean, and I apologize, because I think most of these organizations that get breached think that they're secure, whether they're using automated or manual processes, tools, or whatever, but they think they're meeting whatever measure they've used, and you're saying they need to do more. My question is simply, so they collect all this other data, but they've got to compare it against something.
Sure.
Do they simply need to hire TriMark and experts that know what to look for, or is there something that they can use as a benchmark that's more better than the stuff that we're familiar with?
Yeah, where's the checklist? If I say that I've hardened Windows, what do I compare myself against that goes, this is actually hardened Windows, right? That's a good question.
Yeah, it is a really good question, and I appreciate it. I think that one of the challenges that a lot of organizations have is this typical issue of compliance versus real world security, right? And so
don't make me say PCI.
Exactly.
He just said it.
We end up in a situation where there's auditing to a compliance level. So you have certain compliance frameworks that have to be followed. We have things like CIS and benchmarks for certain things out there, which are a little bit above what Microsoft typically recommends or has beyond their defaults, right? And so that is what everyone kind of goes by and says, all right, in order to harden my environment, I will use CIS because that will get me most of the way there. But we know that compliance doesn't solve security. We've seen it all the time. We've seen it in every environment. Anyone who's run a pen test or red team knows this. So your question is about what are those things that they should be measuring up to, what they should be setting, configuring their environment to. Microsoft has a securing Active Directory white paper. Is that enough? No, it's not. Why? Because these things don't get updated with information about what threats are coming out. And it changes so frequently, I can't even point you to anything that says this is the thing that will be authoritative on this. With that said, though, there are a number of fundamental, or as Paul said, table stakes items We published a white paper on it that has a list of things that you should do that you can do to level up security more quickly in just a matter of weeks. A lot of times the guidance out there is going to be saying, deploy privileged access workstations or admin workstations. Yes, you absolutely should, but that's something that takes a lot of time, effort, energy, money, and shifting a mentality of how people do work. The other guidance from Microsoft years ago was, this tiering model where you have tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, and then they changed that over to a system called RAMP, which leverages cloud services. We still talk to customers about tier 0 being the important thing. So when you're asking, your question is really, what are the things that people should be doing? I don't have anything to point you to today, but I will take that action and put that list together for you.
You know what would be, I think, really nice for this list and/or matrix is the operational impact, potential operational impact. And one of the areas that I want to pick on, because it intersects with my world and firmware, is the Windows platform binary table, right? And we know it can be an attack vector, and this is the functionality for those may have heard on the previous show, where your firmware, your UEFI firmware, can execute a service in Windows with a high privilege level. It's actually one of my nerdy questions, maybe for Sean, what exact privilege level? And I'm sure the answer is depends, but it can actually execute a service from within the firmware. Now you can go remove that service, but the next time you reboot your computer, it's just going to launch it again because the Windows binary and the service lives within the firmware. Now there is a legitimate purpose, and I think this is where we get tricky, Jeff, about what would you recommend as a standard for hardening Windows environments. This is also a legitimate feature. It is abused by attackers, but also a legitimate feature. So if I turn it off, and there's some question about like how off this feature can be, will it impact my operational environment? I put that in my umbrella of operational risk. I think there's a lot of settings like that, Sean, in Active Directory and Windows that fall in that bucket that you're not going to get a Microsoft that comes out with clear guidance on it because they're not going to tell people to go break their stuff, right?
Yes and no. I mean, I agree with that, Paul. And certainly for those of us that have worked in, Department of Defense, DoD, or government type environments, we had the STIG that we worked off of. Mm-hmm. And basically the STIG meant that you apply this group of settings to a system, and then you spent the following weeks or months undoing some of those settings to figure out actually what would make this system usable.
Yes.
So
for the record, I predate Stigs. I'm in Orange Book.
Orange Book. I was going to say
fair.
Just to put it in context.
Absolutely. And so on the VMware side of things, there's a thing called lockdown mode where you could actually set this to lock things down to a level where you have things hardened pretty much automatically. But no one ever does that. Why? Because of the fear of locking it down to the point where you lock yourself out. And I think to a certain extent, we have this fear as well on the Windows side and even really anywhere else, where if we lock things down too much, then things will break and we'll get in trouble. If you go ahead and try to make things more secure, but you break an application and cost the company money, you could get fired for that. But if you do something to improve the security and nobody notices the difference, you're not going to get promoted off of that. And I think that's one of the challenges we have in this industry as well, is if we do our job well, no one knows. If we do our job poorly, everyone finds out that there was a security issue.
Right. And one of the things, it relates to incident response, right? Because we're talking about reducing the attack surface, whether that's pre-breach, during an incident, or after an incident, right? It all relates to incident response. And this could be a big driver, ironically enough, for things like law bins, which there's a website. I think we talked about it last week. There's basically a couple of researchers that put together a project that lists all of the Windows drivers and like their signatures, and they're the ones most likely abused by attackers to escalate privileges on Windows. Now, if I just go in and I use the Windows feature that creates the allow list and block list for drivers, I could break something, right? And so this is where we get into this slippery slope of like how well do we lock down our environment while also allowing it to operate? I'm curious but I think what you're saying, Sean, is what you recommend depends on the customer, their business drivers, and all of that other stuff.
So there are things that are obviously directly specific to the customer environment. But at the same time, there's a lot of recommendations that tend to apply to all environments, most environments. That's why I always get annoyed with SIM vendors when you buy a SIM product, you put it in there, and then you start getting event data flow into it. And then you ask the question of, okay, well, where are the categorization? Where are the alerts? And they say, well, you do that because you know what you care about in your environment. But a lot of those, the attacks are the same. And go ahead and load those in so that way you can detect those attacks and then you can tune the alerts. For me, it's similar where you have an Active Directory environment. There's going to be certain things that are pretty much the same across all of them. We're going to find issues with administrative hygiene. We still have admin accounts that have old passwords that are 5 years old or more. We still have accounts that are associated with a regular person that have a Kerberos service principal name associated with it, and usually an old password as well. We still find Kerberos unconstrained delegation. We still find a number of these things that are still out there that people have not solved yet. One thing that's absolutely crazy to me is when you ask an organization how many domain admins they have and they say 20, but when you actually look at the environment and you expand out the group membership that has another group inside of that, has another group inside of that, and you end up with like 130 accounts that have privileged Active Directory rights. It's 2023.
Well, you're bringing,
I don't know why we have that.
You're bringing up yet another layer to this, and I apologize for being. I feel like I'm being particularly ornery today, but maybe I'm just being me.
Just being you.
What you just said is a lot of organizations aren't really even doing and following the things that they're allegedly following anyway in terms of CIS benchmarks or compliance or regulation, whatever the standard is that they're meeting, which I agree with. And so my question would be, what would be the delta between organizations that really were actually following and doing the things that like CIS recommended or other regulatory bodies, STIGs or whatever, versus they say they're doing it and they're getting the compliance check mark, but they're not really doing it, not well, not completely. And part of that is because they think automation has solved the problem. They've got some tool that they dropped in because they went to Black Hat 7 years ago and bought something. What's the difference between just following the stuff that's out there already versus what we've been talking about in terms of you got to do more, you got to do extra and beyond the things that we're not able to qualify. We just know that there needs to be more.
Yeah. So
yeah. Sorry, I'm posing these untenable questions.
I appreciate the hard questions. I mean, the challenge that I certainly have is, I've been talking about the same things for years now, about membership in your admin groups, be it the domain admins group, the domain administrators group, enterprise admins. What are those accounts? Why are they there? What are the service accounts that are there? We're still finding exchange accounts in domain admins, things like an LDAP user in exchange in domain admins. These things that just don't belong there. And these are obvious hygiene things that if someone looked, they would go, why is this here? And so I think part of the problem is at a lot of organizations, you're busy fighting fires, keeping things going, and your role is operations. And the security side ends up focusing on malware and these things that pop off on different workstations and trying to figure out what those look like. And a lot of times there ends up being a disconnect as far as, okay, who's really looking at the security of Active Directory or Office 365, Microsoft 365, Azure AD, Entra ID, whatever we want to call it. What are we looking at there? What are we looking at with VMware? How do we know that those systems?
I think you're being too generous, Sean. I don't think most organizations are asking who's looking at this. I think they're assuming somebody's looking at this.
Right, which is the next part of that, which is who's looking at it. I think someone else is handling this. And the audits that are getting done are not exposing these as issues. The pen tests and red teams are probably exposing some of them. But again, in incremental format or fashion, where you can say, okay, well, we identified that this account, we were able to password spray it, we were able to get domain admin. Okay, we fixed that. We updated that account with a new password. What else you got? Okay, next time something
Sean,
else.
You're uncovering a systematic or systemic problem in pen tests, which is that, I mean, how many, and I realize this is an off-the-cuff thing, I'm sorry, I'm putting you on the spot. How many pen tests or pen testers or pen test companies do you think check to see if their Active Directory is backed up, a client's Active Directory is backed up, restorable, and other things like that? Active Directory is not the only thing or only item of that type.
I
didn't know Nessus checked for that.
I bet I can think of one person that does, because that person will probably want to go get copies of that backup and use them for their exploitative purposes, and that's Tyler.
Well, yeah, that's. Sean, I want to also dig on along these lines too. And I don't want to say there's good pen tests and bad pen tests out there, right? But a trap you could fall into is, in your example, if they were password spraying their way to domain admin, they may not report. Now, good pen testers probably will, right? But they may not report, oh, you still have NTLM, or you're vulnerable to Kerber roasting. And some of the older SMV V2 versus V3 kind of style attacks, some of these older Microsoft protocols that I used to use when I was pen testing that largely people should have fixed. I imagine you still find this stuff in people's environments, and it's still a lot of work to clean it up because of all dependency hell. Oh, I've got Mac OS systems on there, which means I can only go to this version. Is that still true? Like if you're supporting Mac OS, right? You can't wipe out some of these older authentication and SMB protocols?
I believe that macOS is fine. We tend to see this more in the Nix types of devices and appliances, which, Paul, we've had a conversation before where everything's a computer now, and if it's a computer, it's probably running some version of Linux or some flavor of Linux. Yeah. It's typically the Nix type appliances, and oftentimes what we've seen with vendor appliances, even on the VMware side, this is crazy. You can have a VMware appliance, and that VMware appliance, I can almost guarantee you, has not been patched or restarted in 5, 6, 7 years. So that's one part of it. If you have a Nix appliance that is used for storage, is used for something on the network that users are interacting with, it's very likely that does not support SMB v2, or if it does support it, it may not be up to the current version of whatever that appliance OS is that supports it. We've seen a lot of environments where there's older appliances or older versions of the OS on that appliance or that appliance OS where it can't support NTLM v2. It can't support SMB v2 or 3 or anything newer than that. And then that runs into a situation where it doesn't talk the modern Microsoft security protocols. And how weird a sentence is that? We're talking about Microsoft security protocols that are modern, and the Linux side is what is preventing the environment to get up to something that is more secure.
Yeah, and this is where we get into trouble. Like, once you've had a breach, we want to go fix more stuff. Well, we can't fix all that. Well, they say they can't fix all that stuff because of all of these dependencies. And so it becomes a much larger project, things like laps. I did a talk on this like 10 years ago now. Right. Like, I still can't believe this stuff is, I guess I can. Some of me can, but some of me like doesn't want to still have this conversation, Sean, with people. I want them to have fixed all this stuff.
Paul, I've got a talk that I gave 25 years ago, and it's still relevant today.
Well,
so
there you go.
So don't be too discouraged, like me.
Well, the other thing is we assess a bunch of environments that are manufacturing environments, and it's really fascinating to see environments that have ICS systems that have different types of devices or robots or what have you. We've looked at pipelines. We've looked at the manufacturing and factory type environments, including AD force that span multiple factories across a region, or even just have one or two. And there are a lot of Windows-based systems that run in those environments that are then joined to that Active Directory, and older protocols in those environments where you have vendors that configured and set this up 5 years ago, and maybe that vendor's not around anymore, and you end up with an electrician that's the domain admin. So that's where things get really interesting and complicated, is in these environments which are not your typical company. You have office workers using whatever programs they have on their computer, including a web browser and an email system and whatever else. But you have these computers that connect to robots that shift around and build things.
Yeah, and that's, again, back to the business drivers. Obviously, the business has to run. That stuff needs to be operational. In a security, if you're coming in going, oh, you should replace that with a more modern Windows operating system. And you're like, well, my software that supports that critical business function doesn't run on that modern version of Windows. And here we are.
So you've been in healthcare.
Yeah. Yeah, healthcare is another great example, Larry.
Yep, exactly.
For sure.
I love the example about the electrician as a domain admin. Go ask Tyler about the vulnerability assessment that turned into an accidental pen test on a company that he did, small company, where 398 of the 405 users in Active Directory were domain admins.
Wow.
Ouch.
I've had clients where the domain admins used their domain admin account to log on in the morning and do all their daily activities, checking email and
you're not supposed
surfing
to do
the web
that.
and whatever. No, you're not supposed to do that.
This is why I drink. Like, seriously, some of these companies are fantastic. They try. They do as good as they can. Some companies are like, security. What's that?
But,
good.
I feel like we're painting a pretty bleak picture, which it is a pretty bleak picture. If I may interject, and I'd be interested in Sean and everybody else's opinion. I sort of lump all this into the category of, vulnerabilities, misconfigurations. Our industry for 25 years or more has tried to, if we can just eliminate all of this, that'll drive down the variable in the risk equation, and we'll get to that acceptable level of risk. AKA will be secure. I think it's more of a constant. It's always there. So what else do you do? What else can you do? And I think that's where true security comes into play in terms of people knowing their network, knowing their systems, knowing what's normal, being able to monitor and respond to and detect the abnormal and figure out, it goes back to the Cliff Stall, cuckoo's egg. He was just looking at his monthly bill and noticed a discrepancy of something like 50, 70 cents.
89 cents.
It was 89 cents. Thank you. And he dug into it and said, that's not right. And he tried to figure out what was wrong. And he exposed a whole, hacking ring that was going after, at the time, military secrets at a research university. But, that's the part that we don't teach. That's the part that I don't know if it is teachable. But that's the part I think that at the end of the day, once all this other stuff is done and we argue it only works up to a point. There's still got to be people there that are like, this is my system, this is my network, this is my operation, and and I know people like this. I've had many clients like this that have had the attitude, not on my watch, not on my box. Of course, nothing's a box anymore.
We were talking about the cuckoo's egg accounting discrepancy. It was 75 cents.
75 cents. Whatever. Sorry. It was less than $1.
Make sure we accurate.
$18.99 to account for inflation.
Performed. Thank you, fact check team. Appreciate that.
It made Josh look stupid because he was so adamant about it being 89 cents. It's
I remembered it as 89. I remembered it as 89, but it was 20 years ago that I read the book.
But my point is, there's more to security than simply secure configurations, eliminating all the vulnerabilities, patching, keeping things up to date, upgrading, and so on and so forth. Because you can only do that up to a point, and companies struggle with that, and they try to automate the crap out of having to do all that, and that only works up to a point. And a lot of this stuff is good, and a lot of this stuff makes you better, makes you more secure. But at the end of the day, there's something else that needs to happen. And I think this is the answer to the part of the answer to the question that I asked you, Sean, and I apologize for putting you on the spot. That level setting, that resetting, that double checking things, I think that only works up to a point. And then you still have to have people that know the environment, know the operation, and have some sense of what's normal so that they're more likely to notice when something's abnormal. whether it's through an automated, SIM or whatever, and they're looking at, the 10 million alerts that they just kind of click through every morning while they're drinking their coffee, but they notice something that's different. The bad guys have been exploiting, flying under the radar of normal for centuries, really. I mean, this is not unique to the cyber world, but I don't think. I'm sorry, the sun is hitting me there. I don't think we as security professionals, cybersecurity professionals, do enough to emphasize and try to teach and preach that organizations, they can only rely on all this stuff up to a point, but they still got to have people in the know that are doing things that are aware of what's going on, so that they can do the monitoring and detection type of activities. Agree or disagree?
I agree. I mean, I think inventory of your environment, knowing what is normal, what is anomalous, is core to security. Part of it is certainly the configuration of the environment and having settings in configurations that are going to ensure that configurations are secure and hardened against what attackers are typically going to do. But the other side of that is understanding that if Sally doesn't work after 7 p.m. at night and someone sees that her account is in use, it's probably not her. There's got to be better ways for us to be able to monitor and understand what's happening in the environment. Part of that, I feel, often comes down to standardization around account naming. Far too often during assessments, we see accounts that are just, the names are all over the place, and it's not obvious to identify what account is a service account, what account is an admin account, what account is maybe an Active Directory admin account, what account is a cloud admin account. And oftentimes we get pushback on that because it goes, well, that's to obfuscate what they're for. But the attackers know what accounts have highly privileged rights. So you're not fooling anyone. You're just making it more difficult to be able to alert on certain accounts that are doing activities that probably shouldn't be. So, yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, I think
it's better that way.
Knowing your environment is important, but also having a system that alerts you of those, deviations and maintaining that system is super important as well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you can't do this all by hand these days. There absolutely needs to be automation involved. But, which breach was it 10 years ago? Was it Home Depot or Target where, it was auditors that came in and noticed stuff that was being reported on, and I forget the name of whatever solution that they had in place, but they were getting the alerts. It was all there, but the people just weren't seeing it. It was a third party that came.
That was the Target hack. Yeah.
It was Target. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and what was getting the alerts? The SOC was reporting them, but and it was I think it was a third party SOC.
Yeah, was that the HVAC system or something?
Oh, that's how they got in. Their HVAC contractor was offered a direct input into the accounting system for invoicing.
It'll be solved in a minute because the sun is moving at thousands of miles an hour.
So, and then that's how they got in. And but the SOC reported that there were problems, issues, anomalies, and nobody paid attention.
Right, because it didn't hit whatever threshold, or nobody knew what to do with it. But that's part of the danger of. I mean, ironically, Paul, we argue over the best hacker movie being Sneakers or Hackers, but Sneakers came out in 92. War Games came out in 83, and what was the lesson of War Games? Don't rely on the automation to solve all your problems. I mean, that's essentially the message, and that's people like, well, the tools say we're fine, so we must be fine.
And I thought the lesson was that you can make free phone calls on payphones, but that was just me.
Yeah, War Games was.
I defy you to find a payphone these days.
War Games was 1983. Sneakers was 1992.
92. Yeah.
92.
I mean, so this is an 83 concept, which means it was probably around since the 70s. Bouncing around, and somebody decided to make a movie about it. And I thought myself, as much as anybody. We haven't solved this problem because, especially in the private sector, it's all about we gotta meet our compliance requirements. We gotta get the boxes checked. We gotta do all the right things, and we don't really know what we're doing. So let's throw a bunch of product and vendor solutions at it, and think we're good. I agree with you can be compliant and not secure, but I disagree with that too if you're doing it right. But that's another argument for another day.
I think compliance is the first step. I think getting to a baseline is the first step. The problem is that there are a lot of things that have been done and configured in the environment that people didn't realize or fully understand what the implications of those settings are, and didn't follow the security principles, because compliance settings often come down to a specific implementation of a security principle. And if we followed the principle of least privilege, we would have a lot less breaches, but we don't.
Oh my God. What? Say that again. Make it into a T-shirt or a meme or a sticker. I've had so many clients over the years, and Sean, everybody else knows. I don't know if you know, but I've been doing PCI for 20 years. So I've been dealing with clients that have been, trying to follow a particular checkbox. Some doing it better than others, but I've had so many arguments with admins, both on the Unix, Linux side as well as the Windows side, about you really don't need to have admin privileges. You don't need to be using the admin account, especially the domain admin account. That should really be, those credentials should be literally written down on a piece of paper, in an envelope, locked in a safe, and in case of emergency, break glass. And they look at me like, what the hell are you talking about?
Jeff, how else should I check my email and do all my internet browsing and do my Amazon shopping if I don't use my admin creds? Come on, man. You're being unreasonable.
Well, the craziest thing is when you find
security principles are unreasonable, Josh.
The craziest thing is when you start finding downloaded browser like Opera on a domain controller.
Oh God.
That's what freaks me out. That's my horror story.
I'm waiting for you to come back and go, and last week I found LimeWire. Like, these. As I've gotten older,
AI solves everything, and in 2 weeks we're going to get the solutions to everything because AI solves it.
That's right.
Jeff, you need to smoke something other than tobacco, okay? So, or you already are, depending. But anyway, no, look, the silver bullet product doesn't exist. We all know that. But what does exist is doing the fundamentals. And I know I harp on this all the time.
But nobody wants to do the fundamentals, Josh.
If you did the fundamentals, look, I still firmly am convinced that 80% of security is good system administration and good security administration. Has nothing to do with very highly advanced configs, the tools, the SIM, the whatever.
Yeah,
I still think
Sean, that's why I like your point, Sean, of once you've done the incident response, now is the opportunity for a whole host of reasons. One being you're kind of in that mode already to go start hardening the rest of your environment for a whole number of different reasons. I mean, the business doesn't want it to happen again. So I think we should be kind of pitching it because you're going to have a little bit of salesperson aspect to this, right? Pitching to the business, hey, okay, we closed down the holes for this breach and respond to this incident. There's a list of other things that we should do just to make sure this doesn't happen again. And even if you just harp on that one point, we all give a lot of reasons for auditing your environment. Harp on that one point, I think we can get more done.
Yeah, I agree with that. One thing that I find interesting, and it's more of an anecdotal type analysis for me, is a significant number, a significant portion of people that reach out to Trimark to talk about security, specifically Active Directory, often is someone that's in a new role, new CISO, new Director of Information Security, in a new role of Director of IT or what have you. And one of the big things they say is, hey, I'm new in this role. I've been here for a few months. Based on what I'm seeing, I feel like there's more to this environment that I need to figure out. And so really the question is, I need to understand what is our security posture? What are the things I should be concerned about? And really, what are the things that I should focus on? And to what was said earlier is, nobody wants to do the fundamentals. And that's one of the challenges. We can solve lateral movement today with just standard Windows and Active Directory. You don't have to buy a product to solve lateral movement. You set some group policy settings that limit who can log on to the systems. You don't even have to have the local admin passwords change. You can go ahead and set those policies so that you can't log into them over the network. That'll break a lot of ransomware. Then you set the firewall, the one that comes with Windows, the base host-based firewall, to block SMB traffic across your workstations, which shouldn't happen anyway. You do that and you block 90+% of your lateral movement from any attack and ransomware. Why don't we do that? Because that's harder than buying a product. Now we move into zero trust. Has that solved problems?
No, I agree. I think a lot of people misunderstand zero trust as that silver bullet, when it's more of a philosophy and ideology, if you will. I had a better word for it. It's along those lines, and it's not the practical things that you should be doing. You need to have the practical stuff first before you go, I want to adopt a zero trust philosophy. Although I could argue that, maybe I will argue, that segmenting or protecting your workstations with the Windows host-based firewall is an activity that falls under the zero trust umbrella, right? I think it is certainly one of those activities. I would add on to what you said, Sean, and say you should put RDP in that bucket as well. I think that's important. I've seen others block things like ICMP. That can be done, and all those things. All these little things that we talk about just make the attacker's job that much harder, which could increase your ability to detect that attacker as they work harder. If you make it too easy, you're probably not going to detect them, certainly out of the gate, right? Right.
There are a number of environments that we've looked at and assessed in Active Directory for sure that have had a number of problems. We do hundreds of checks and we have lots of sections in the report. And in certain environments, we've seen that in just about every section, there's an issue, and we have to highlight and do a lot of writing in order to provide good recommendations on how to fix that, how to prioritize it so they can get this done, then this, and they can work on the easier things and get the quick wins done first. There have been a handful of environments where we're pretty certain we found persistence, where there's an active attacker that has some sort of embedded in the environment. That's not what we do. We're not doing compromise assessment, but we kind of follow this standard of, if it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And in those situations, we've actually told the customer, you should really get a compromise assessment because we're fairly certain that there's something here that doesn't look right. And so when it comes down to it, these things that we found that are problematic stem from these fundamentals not being in place. Principal least privilege is one of the biggest ones. Making sure that passwords aren't 10 or 15 or 20 years old. Things that seem obvious but are overlooked for some reason. And I think it comes down to what was mentioned earlier. That person's looking at it or that person's looking at it. Someone's looking at it. I don't know who.
Sean, you said you have some guides on the TriMark website to help people harden their Windows environments. Is that true?
We have a white paper that we published that was based on a webcast that we did that has a number, probably a couple dozen of recommendations on how to tighten up Active Directory quickly with low impact to no impact in the environment. So that's at hub.trimarksecurity.com, and it's a white paper on how to improve Active Directory security quickly. Awesome. Sean, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly. Thank you. And I will be out at Vegas. If you want to go and meet up with the TriMark team, you can sign up at trimarksecurity.com. We have a link down towards the bottom to join us in Vegas. We've got a couple things going on there. And we also have a new product coming out in the new year called TriMark Vision, which I encourage everyone to reach out and ask me about. I've heard about that. I think it's great, by the way. Awesome. Thank you. Awesome stuff, Sean. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul, and everyone. Appreciate it. With that, we'll take a short break and come back with the security news. Stay tuned.